the new god of divinity, the new gods of divinity, a new god of divinity, the new goddess of divinity, the new goddesses of divinity, a new goddess of divinity, the old god of divinity, the old gods of divinity, a old god of divinity, the old goddess of divinity, the old goddesses of divinity, a old goddess of divinity, the greater god of divinity, the greater gods of divinity, a greater god of divinity, the greater goddess of divinity, the greater goddesses of divinity, a greater goddess of divinity, the lesser god of divinity, the lesser gods of divinity, a lesser god of divinity, the lesser goddess of divinity, the lesser goddesses of divinity, a lesser goddess of divinity, the greater spirit of divinity, the greater spirits of divinity, a greater spirit of divinity, the lesser spirit of divinity, the lesser spirits of divinity, a lesser spirit of divinity, the major god of divinity, the major gods of divinity, a major god of divinity, the major goddess of divinity, the major goddesses of divinity, a major goddess of divinity, the minor god of divinity, the minor gods of divinity, a minor god of divinity, the minor goddess of divinity, the minor goddesses of divinity, a minor goddess of divinity, the superior god of divinity, the superior gods of divinity, a superior god of divinity, the superior goddess of divinity, the superior goddesses of divinity, a superior goddess of divinity, the inferior god of divinity, the inferior gods of divinity, a inferior god of divinity, the inferior goddess of divinity, the inferior goddesses of divinity, a inferior goddess of divinity, the ancestor god of divinity, the ancestor gods of divinity, a ancestor god of divinity, the ancestor goddess of divinity, the ancestor goddesses of divinity, a ancestor goddess of divinity, the ascendant god of divinity, the ascendant gods of divinity, a ascendant god of divinity, the ascendant goddess of divinity, the ascendant goddesses of divinity, a ascendant goddess of divinity, the descendant god of divinity, the descendant gods of divinity, a descendant god of divinity, the descendant goddess of divinity, the descendant goddesses of divinity, a descendant goddess of divinity, the transcendent god of divinity, the transcendent gods of divinity, a transcendent god of divinity, the transcendent goddess of divinity, the transcendent goddesses of divinity, a transcendent goddess of divinity, the future god of divinity, the future gods of divinity, a future god of divinity, the future goddess of divinity, the future goddesses of divinity, a future goddess of divinity, the present god of divinity, the present gods of divinity, a present god of divinity, the present goddess of divinity, the present goddesses of divinity, a present goddess of divinity, the past god of divinity, the past gods of divinity, a past god of divinity, the past goddess of divinity, the past goddesses of divinity, a past goddess of divinity, the god of divinity, the gods of divinity, a god of divinity, the goddess of divinity, the goddesses of divinity, a goddess of divinity, the half god of divinity, the half gods of divinity, a half god of divinity, the half goddess of divinity, the half goddesses of divinity, a half goddess of divinity, the vessel of divinity, the vessels of divinity, a vessel of divinity, the person of divinity, the persons of divinity, a person of divinity, the image of divinity, the images of divinity, a image of divinity, the imagination of divinity, the imaginations of divinity, a imagination of divinity, the belief of divinity, the beliefs of divinity, a belief of divinity, the thought of divinity, the thoughts of divinity, a thought of divinity, the word of divinity, the words of divinity, a word of divinity, the action of divinity, the actions of divinity, a action of divinity, the reaction of divinity, the reactions of divinity, a reaction of divinity, the situation of divinity, the situations of divinity, a situation of divinity, the circumstance of divinity, the circumstances of divinity, a circumstance of divinity, the relationship of divinity, the relationships of divinity, a relationship of divinity, the number of divinity, the numbers of divinity, a number of divinity, the formula of divinity, the formulas of divinity, a formula of divinity, the equation of divinity, the equations of divinity, a equation of divinity, the symbol of divinity, the symbols of divinity, a symbol of divinity, the color of divinity, the colors of divinity, a color of divinity, the thing of divinity, the things of divinity, a thing of divinity, the way of divinity, the ways of divinity, a way of divinity, the place of divinity, the places of divinity, a place of divinity, the time of divinity, the times of divinity, a time of divinity, the event of divinity, The events of divinity. A event of divinity. The result of divinity. The results of divinity. A result of divinity.